you mentioned that Spain doesn't allow dual nationality.
No, Spain does not allow.
And it sounded like you're being put in a position of either breaking the law or having no nationality whatsoever for
That is exactly the case at the moment. Now, this has come up because of the ETA. The new things coming for Britain that we haven't quite hit ours yet. So yeah, Spain only allows dual nationality with some South American countries, and normally they are the ones like people who fled Spain previously, or from the Canary Islands actually after the volcanic eruptions and things like that. So there's Colombia, Peru, anyway. So you are not allowed, apart from a handful of South American countries, to hold dual nationality. So if I was to apply for Spanish, to be a Spanish citizen, I would renounce my I would have to renounce my British citizenship, pay the UK government to renounce that. Actually, there's a fee for that, by the way, as well, and only have my Spanish. Now, a lot of people don't, okay? I'm not going to get anyone into trouble here. So what they will do, but they are actually breaking the law, is some people will use their British passport to just travel into the UK. So normally most dual nationals would do that, who are allowed to have dual nationality. You use your UK passport to travel into, say, the UK, and your American one to go to America. That's common. What's happened now at the moment is, yes, so to travel currently into the UK on the ETA, if you are a UK citizen, or nationality, you must use your UK passport, okay? So that is a stipulation. At the moment, you're not allowed dual nationality. We have to renounce our nationality. So you either have to apply for a British passport to come into the UK or without your ETA, because if you have two nationalities, you have to state you have two nationalities, but travel on your British passport. However, if you've got Spanish citizenship, you have to then lie to say that you don't have a second nationality, or you'll be in breach of the Spanish rules as such. So if you're a British national with a Spanish passport, Spanish citizenship, you have to apply for British passport. So the British say you have to travel on your British passport if you have dual nationality. But then you would be in breach of Spanish nationality rules by doing that, because you really should never use a second passport if you've got Spanish nationality. So you would have to lie on the ETA form and say that you don't hold a second nationality if you had a Spanish passport, but were also British. So I actually had, I was speaking to Professor Michaela Benson about this yesterday, and she's aware of it too. And we just feel it's something that the UK authorities have not thought of. And while she says it's kind of legal guidance, it's not legal, and people should just do whatever they should to work a way around it. So my partner, his kids are in a situation at the moment. So they have American and British dual nationality. They're currently in America. They're coming over in the summer. Their British passports have expired, so they have found themselves in the same situation. So because they have dual nationality, they must travel into the UK on a British passport, not with their American passport and an ETA. So now they are rushing to try and get their British passports in America at great expense so they can fit in the rules properly. You see, but obviously with Spanish, we're not allowed to have two passports, so we have to kind of lie about it to do it. So we are waiting guidance. Sue, our chair, has written to the Cabinet Office and to the Embassy, and we're awaiting guidance, but we expect that something's going to have to change there. It's just something they haven't thought through.
I was quite shocked about, as a student myself, the fact that British national students who happen to live overseas are paying the frankly extortionate international fees, which I thought, considering I already think that my fees are expensive and I'm paying home fees.
I was lucky, like my daughter went before the transition period. So, but actually I think the government did allow 3, so it was 2020, I think it came into effect for 2024. So they allowed us about a 3-year grace period where we were still on home fees. And luckily my daughter, who attended Manchester, fell under that. So I was okay. But now, international fees. It's bizarre. Yeah,
it is. It doesn't make sense to me. It really doesn't. I mean, the sort of second thing that I get to my sort of question was that I remember a talk I attended recently with the ambassador of the EU to the UK. He said that I think about immigration, which I think is something here, is that it matters that you're describing as freedom of movement, which I think he would agree with you on that's freedom of movement. He said that we'd call immigration, because we use the sort of strict people in, people out, that's immigration. But the EU will see like, well, they're a student, they're only staying here a year, up to 5 years or something. That's not really going to do much. So, I mean, would you say that's probably one of the logics that underlined Brexit, was that the sort of difference in immigration? And then my sort of main question is, how many of these bureaucratic issues are down from sort of ignorance / incompetence, and how many of them are sort of more deliberate, targeted?
What do you mean, the bureaucratic?
I mean, I suppose like just the general issues you described. A lot of it just seems like an overloaded of bureaucracy that you're having to deal with as British people living in Europe now.
There is quite a lot of bureaucracy involved. Yeah, I think there's 100%, there's a huge difference the way Europeans think about freedom of movement to British people. I do think that's because we were never in Schengen and we're an island, and there's a lot of exceptionalism. And, I mean, when I first moved to Spain, I wasn't paying taxes here. I was paying them in the UK, and I spoke to an accountant, and then it was like, oh, it doesn't matter. As long as you're paying taxes somewhere in the EU, it's fine. See how you get on for a few years. No one really cared about, even because, you were part of the same system, paying into the same system. People don't worry about, students overstaying. So what? They work. It's like, it's far more relaxed. It's just, a lot of people, I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of people used freedom of movement, and Brits get a bad stick for this. Oh, they were overstaying anyway. They're second homeowners, and they shouldn't have been there. And they were, they always say 6 months of the year, and they never registered, and they should have registered. And that's true. But it's not just British who do that. All Europeans do that. They just move around. Some people permanently move. They go from one country to another, to another, to another, to another. And while they may not all register, you're supposed to register in every country, 3 months, register at the town hall, make sure that you state that you're there. And it's just really for census figures, and know who's in the district and things like that, for funding for your local councils, things like that. So many people don't do it, but we took that for granted. Now, bureaucracy, yes, there is a lot of bureaucracy. Now, Spain's quite unusual in the fact that it never put a deadline in exchanging our documents. So France, Netherlands, a lot of other countries have. So in theory, we believe that there are a lot of undocumented Brits still in Spain. Under the radar, they call it. You only call it illegal, of course, if you're brown skin, not if you're British. That's kind of the way it goes. But literally, there are a lot. And we are expecting some issues, Bremain, when the EES comes into force, because if you have an all green piece of paper, which is the old residency document, you will not be able to travel in and out of Spain without getting your passport stamped. So when it comes in, it's going to pick up all the overstayers. And I think there are a lot of Brits here who are scared to try and upgrade to their TIE, which is your biometric residency card, because they're unsure if they were here legally before the end of the transition period. So a lot of it is bureaucracy. You needed to be in the healthcare system. This is one that lets a lot of people down. So they were here. They might have had a green residence paper, but they maybe weren't employed on a contract that gave them healthcare through the national health system, or they maybe didn't have a private health policy. and they were using the UK NHS system for their medicals. These are the type of people who are struggling to get their upgraded residency documents. But we know from recent discussions with the embassy that there could be between 100 and 200,000 Brits in Spain who have not upgraded that document. And that will be a bureaucratic nightmare. And we're encouraging people to do it. But it's going to be a tough one. And we do think there's a lot of people here who shouldn't be here. That doesn't necessarily mean they're claiming anything off the system or putting any pressure on, services, but us Brits were quite bad at working cash in hand sometimes, and things like that. I personally know many people in I'm in Lanzarote who worked and were never in the system. So it's not great, but yeah, British people, and a lot of those people actually support Brexit, believe it or not. That's the type. Yeah.
Just to pick up on the education point, so am I right in saying then that students from other EU countries who studied in the UK in the past and got UK degrees, those degrees are now no longer recognised in
It depends on the qualification, and so if they've done a qualification and which country. So France may recognise, an architect certificate or something like that, an architectural degree, but Netherlands may not. It's very, very hit and miss. The teaching one I know is recognised, but yeah, it's very hit and miss. Depends which country you're in and what the qualification is, but there's no blanket. There's no blanket kind of acceptance as there was previously. And of course, the educational standards and most degrees and qualifications are very similar across Europe. You're good to be educated, if you do architecture, you do engineering, or you do things like that. I think medically, most of them are still, I can't quite remember, I'm not an expert on that, but yeah, but there's dozens and dozens of them are not. So yeah, these poor EU students, many of them, who came to the UK to study and obtain a professional qualification, would maybe not have that qualification now recognised, and they would, I don't know what happens, but there is some talk about trying to have all that reinstated, but in the pile of stuff that Britain wants to negotiate and wants to improve, I just don't see it coming very quickly at the moment. I think the government have their eyes set maybe on musicians and touring visas initially, but I don't see anything on the qualification side coming at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, and this, just to be absolutely clear, this applies retrospectively. So people who studied in the UK 20 years ago no longer have
it applies retrospectively. So if British studied in the EU too, they may not have their qualifications recognised either. Although we do feel that more British students would have maybe done it 1 year of a degree in a European country and then kind of gone back. It wasn't as common to come and do your full 3 years or 4 years degree in a European country for British people as it was the other way around, although of course it did happen as well.
I was on a street stall in Leeds yesterday with Leeds for Europe and talking to various people like we do, and about the problems that they just experience on an everyday basis. So it's similar to yours, in people in Spain. Different because it's the Netherlands, because of course there's a whole load of different rules now. Netherlands have rules, Spain has rules, Portugal has rules, so it's not like a level playing field like it used to be. Although individual countries have individual rules, it's now so much more complicated. So my question really is about how can we articulate these problems? Because when I was talking to a couple yesterday, they were just amazed that they kind of knew about freedom of movement, but they didn't really understand the nitty-gritty of the problem. So, for example, both my daughter and her partner work for a farmer, and they could, in the past, have gone to work in Belgium. They could have gone to work in Italy, but they can't. They're now basically stuck in, I mean, not that they mind, but they're now stuck in the Netherlands. But if a job opportunity came up in Poland, they couldn't really move because the slate is wiped clean, even though they've lived in the Netherlands now for 6 or 7 years. So I think these kind of itty bitty real problems experienced by people, how do we get that across?
What I find works is pointing out that while not many people care about us Brits who live in Europe, let's face about it, it's not on people's radars, and that's fair enough. They just think that we're lucky to live there, but like I say, the tragedy is we moved here when we were EU citizens. To remove our status for your own government, to remove your status like that is the tragedy. And I think when talking to people, it's about this issue. I think just reinstating the fact that it's only British people that have a disadvantage to 450 million other Europeans. It's only us. For us Brits, I think it's more getting the government to appreciate the issues we have. I would always try to explain to people, the university fees is one that people are absolutely shocked at. A British child living in Spain, if they wanted to go back to study in the UK, has to pay international university fees. That's always something that works, but I'm afraid there's just not a lot of sympathy out there for us. And it's a very difficult one to get, but I think it's just to keep hammering on that we just don't have, British people just don't have the opportunities that Europeans do. We're the only people at a disadvantage. The loss of freedom of movement only affected British people, nobody else. But getting that across is very, very difficult. And so, we just, we're lucky that we have our rights enshrined under the withdrawal agreement. Now, I'm not sure if people understand really what that means. I mean, it's not huge, but it basically means that our rights were frozen. So, for example, pensions. Before, if you worked in any EU state, your pensions would be aggregated. So if you worked in the UK, if you worked in Spain, Netherlands, whatever, it all come together. Now that doesn't happen. If we're under the withdrawal agreement, that happens. So that's guaranteed. If I retire here, my healthcare is guaranteed by the British government. My pension pools will be amalgamated by the British and Spanish governments. That doesn't happen anymore. And people don't realize it's the same. So if a Spanish nurse wants to go to the UK to work, why would they go and work in the UK for 5 years when their contributions do not contribute to their pension anymore? So that's something, an issue that is another thing. And there's so many little things like that I think if people realize the whole basket of problems, they would be a lot more, to us.
So I have 2 grandchildren born post 2020. So this is significant.
Are they dual nationals, Jackie, or are they British?
No, they're British. They won't get. They've got their little Dutch identity card. I mean, they're 2 and 4, but they do have the, so they have the right to reside there because their parents have, the big 5-year visa thing. But the uncertainty about their futures in terms of where they belong, who knows what will happen when they turn 16. It's like and what their rights if they for some reason had to come back to the UK. It's all, I mean, they have British passports, but they've got some special thing. And the other thing that people don't realise is the cost of applying for a British passport for very young children, if you're not in Britain, is big. But if you're in the Netherlands or in Spain, it's absolutely astronomical. I'm sure you've heard stories like this, and so et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So every step of the process of wherever you live, if you're a British citizen in an EU country, is mired in difficulty. So, for example, when the children were born, you just went along to the British Embassy in Amsterdam and you did the paperwork, and it cost you kind of like €10 or something. Now they've changed that. Now you have to get it translated even though the document is already Dutch English, you now have to get it specially translated into English by some notary. I'm sure you understand about notaries,
Yes.
Lisa. Yes.
Everything's done by
We're not aware
notaries.
of notaries in this country,
I know.
honestly. And they have to, it's like something like 108 euros to pay the notary to translate this legal document that's already translated, into English. Because the Dutch, being very kind, issue you the birth certificate in both English and Dutch. And it's like, so it's just kind of the costs mount up and the complications and the bureaucracy. So that's, and that is very difficult on a street stall to explain to somebody, well, this is the shit, excuse my language, that my children have to put up with because of Boris,
absolutely right.
because of Boris Johnson. Sorry.
Because of Boris Johnson, and I think that's where the anger lies. The EU were very, very keen to negotiate a much broader withdrawal agreement.
Yeah.
Quite rightly, they focused immediately on citizens' rights, as the EU are quite focused on with Brits living in Europe, and but because Boris Johnson wanted to get Brexit done, a lot of things fell through the cracks. So there should have been, musicians, there should have been a lot more within that withdrawal agreement, but everything is costly. And like I say, your grandchildren, they may grow up, they may marry someone from the Netherlands, and then they may never be able to go back to the UK because they may not be able to take a partner with them because they won't qualify for visas and income requirements.
When I gave birth to my daughter, who now lives in the Netherlands, I was living in Switzerland. And she has a slightly different passport to other people, which goes back to the 80s when the rules were changed. So it's the minutiae of this detail that you have to get on top of is mind-blowing, really. And it's just it just stops that freedom of movement, which I think we lost. But it's not just the ability to sort of just move about, it's all the stuff that goes with it.
Absolutely. I think Europeans have a very different understanding of freedom of movement than British do. So Europeans really equate it with travel, freedom of traveling. And in some ways you could say that everybody who came on holiday to Europe from Britain in some ways was exercising their freedom of movement before Brexit, because they could have gone anywhere and stayed for as long as they could. Whereas British people seem to think freedom of movement is wanting to work or live in the EU, and that is it. It just cuts off a lot of people. It's the same paperwork in Spain, by the way, Jackie, or if someone wants to come to Spain, if you want to get a visa, I mean, I have seen the bunch of paperwork you need, and it's like this. There's only 2 places in the UK where you have to physically show up. Everything has to be translated into Spanish. You have to have a police check. There's hundreds and hundreds of pounds worth of visas. Most people will require to pay someone legal in Spain to help them out with it as well. And so all of those costs build up. It's just very, very, very difficult these days if someone wants to come and live in Europe now, unless you're wealthy. There's non-lucrative visas and things like that, and high value visas and nomad visas. And there's a lot of things, but basically all of them require quite a far higher substantial income threshold than it actually costs to live here, because living in Spain is much cheaper, in many European countries than it is in the UK.
As you know, I said earlier, we lived in Switzerland for a while, and my continuing Swiss friends who are British, who have a British passport and a Swiss passport, because of course we did a quick deal with the Swiss. I don't know if you were aware of that. So that if you look at airports at the signs, it often says this and Swiss, CH, so they can decide whether to come in on their British or their Swiss passports. So it'll be interesting to see what's happened now. I'll have to ask. Yeah, they've got a special.
I've always noted the signs, but
yeah. So very quickly after the referendum, because I have a friend who lives in Ticino, in the south of Switzerland, and she said, "Oh yeah, we've got a special deal. We can use that. We can go through the fast lane." And I said, "How did that happen?" She just said, I don't know. So again, but we're back to this, cherry picking. I think what we lost with the European Union when we left the EU was this level playing field, really, on a macro level. There were micro levels. Just say again, because people say, "Oh well, these students all stay here. What's It's terrible." But actually, when my daughter's partner, for a reason I won't go into, he finished a semester earlier than my daughter, and he literally finished his masters and got a letter from his bank saying, please let us know if you are taking a job because we were going to close your bank account because you are no longer a student. And it's like, what? Yeah, because that, obviously you could work illegally, cash in hand, and all that kind of thing. But countries had ways of dealing with students, which we in the UK chose not to do. And I think, this whole thing about illegal immigrants and people overstaying this, that, and the other was because we had no systems in place. So what my daughter's boyfriend did, he kind of got a research assistant post for like 3 months to enable him to stay in the Netherlands. But there was this kind of, I think there was almost a deliberate move in this country to kind of go, oh, look at these awful students overstaying and getting jobs illegally, when in fact there were actually ways of dealing with it if you wanted to do it, and the Dutch dealt with it. You did a degree, the university let the authorities know that you'd finish your degree, and then you were told, right, leave or get a job, or another, or do a PhD or something like that. Yeah. So I think I think there's a lot of underlying administrative things that didn't happen in this country that should have happened, that could have helped us control, in inverted commas, immigration, too many people
Absolutely.
staying.
Absolutely. But I think EU migration, well, we shouldn't call it EU migration because it
No,
wasn't,
no, no,
it
no.
was like freedom of movement. But even with the students, I mean, look at the universities and the education sector in Britain now. Look how much trouble it is in. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that Europeans no longer want to study there. Well, why would you want to study there? You've got, international fees, and then your qualification may not be recognised in your home nation. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And education is one of Britain's, biggest soft powers. That with music and other things like that. And it's just causing absolute chaos. But like as you said about that issue, that lots of Brits in Europe as well, banks just after Brexit just shut down their bank accounts. They would not service the bank accounts anymore because of they didn't have, or not all banks had licenses to operate in every EU country. They had one license which covered them. In the UK, a license in the UK would have covered you for all over Europe. And so lots of people had to change, have their bank account shut down, had to move bank accounts out to Spain. That caused issues for, say, people who had pensions, their pension paid into a UK bank account and then brought it out. So there's so many small issues like that as well. And it's huge. But I think the education side of thing is an absolute tragedy. It really is.
I went to we have a French school in Leeds, and you were talking about the support that the French people get in this country. So they have these consuls. They're called consuls. They're like voluntary workers who are based all over. So Leeds has 2 consuls for the French people living in Leeds. And I went to a meeting at the French school with the French consul, and this whole issue about qualifications came up. I have to say my French wasn't that good, but I followed it. And one of the interesting things about someone who'd been an architect, so they'd done their initial architecture degree in France, but then came over here, worked in an architect's practice, and then did their kind of professional qualifications, if you like, for architecture in the UK. And that hadn't been a problem. And then, of course, we leave the EU. And then now this woman was speaking and said, I now can't move back to France because these additional qualifications in the specialty that she's as an architect in aren't recognised. So I either go back to France and start at the bottom again with a practice and do all the French equivalent exams in architecture. But she said, I'm 40, she was in her 40s and had children. And, she felt trapped. She felt trapped. She could neither, she couldn't go back to France. She was having problems in the UK, in general, because of being French. And it's just these like individual stories that are so desperate, really. And yet they just get ignored, by both the EU and, to be fair, and the British, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be amazed how common these issues are, with people who are mobile, or, but as you say about the French system of representation, it's so much better than Britain's for their overseas constituencies. And I've had a webinar with Unlock Democracy, and we had a French overseas MP on that. The French kind of have this attitude, whereas if you're born French, you are French. It doesn't matter if you lived out of France for 70 years, you are French. And if you get into trouble, it's your French government who will come and pull you out of that. And so they have, quote me on this, I just looked at this before, but I think it's 7 or 11 over. So they have, in Parliament, they have 7 overseas constituencies represented by an MP. So the one is actually for North Europe, which covers London. And there's one for the Americas, Australias, etc. So, and they really treat it seriously. So when there's a French election, sometimes, like say Macron, will travel to London just to have meetings with, like they say, these people who act as kind of spokespeople, and they're part of people's committees and things like this about representation. And he will go there just to speak to French people living in London, which is quite a lot of French people in the UK, to garner their vote. So the French very much see their overseas citizens as very much part of France still, and who should have a say in it, whereas the British government don't, but they have far more representation than we do, and a lot more places to go as well if they get into trouble or they need advice from their governments.
So I have a friend who's lived in Catalonia. So of course, one of the things I think that you'll be more aware of is the difference in the regional rules for just about everything between Catalonia and different, the south and the north. So my friend said that she's been there for 40 years. She's been with although she's completely Spanish in many ways, she still sees people from mostly women. And this is an issue, I think. This is about a lot of women who kind of went to Spain in the sort of 70s and then, I hate the expression, but shacked up with some guy, never married, have no real rights, had an apartment, then Spanish partner, Catalonian partner dies. They've got absolutely no real rights to live in the country because they didn't work. Maybe they had a child, maybe they didn't, and she said there are just, like you say, so many people that she knows who are now women in their, 80s, really, who are really afraid of what's going to happen to them because they don't really have, the stuff they need. And it's a really big issue for women who tend, to outlive their partners. And she said it's just a nightmare. It is a nightmare. And she's always helping people because, of course, many of these people didn't really learn the language properly. She is completely fluent and reads and everything. And she said she's just amazed at what people don't know. Bank accounts, legal stuff. It's just, I'm sure you come across it, Lisa, as well.
I mean, I was speaking to a woman a couple of weeks ago at a party, and she's retired, in her 70s. And she was telling me she moved to Spain 30 odd years ago. So she'd worked for a small amount of time in the UK, moved to Spain, worked for cash, bars, whatever, 30 odd years. But of course, the consequences of that is that she's now living on less than €400 a month. because that's all the pension credit she built up in the UK. And this is that's really common. It's really common. British people, particularly like you say, particularly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, they did come, and a lot of them were working in bars and, you know, things like that, and cash in hand, and they really did not think about their future. And of course, Brexit has really made all of that a lot more difficult for them as well. And we try not to kind of point fingers at Bremain. There's lots of reasons why people may not be regularised. They may be, you know, they don't have digital formats. They might live out in the countryside, like an old person who lives out in the middle of nowhere, you know, which lots of people do. They may not have a grasp of the language, which again, lots of Brits don't in Spain. So there are a lot of issues, and there will be a lot more issues to come around the corner. And I just don't know how a lot of these people are going to be helped, unfortunately.